Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giovanni Concepcion, and I will be your moderator for today's lecture on space governance entitled Manila Calling, the Geopolitics of Space in Southeast Asia. Well, allow me to extend our sincere acknowledgements to our distinguished guests from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Philippines, led by their country director, Ms. Daniela Brown, the German delegation from KAS Working Group of Young Foreign Policy Experts, and members of the 2024 Adenauer Space Security Experts Network, Philippine Fellows of KAS Philippines. I also want to recognize the presence of Dr. Joel Joseph Marciano Jr., the Director General of the Philippine Space Agency, along with our Deputy Director General Dennis Villorente, who oversees the space operations, infrastructure, and industry. Joining them are Director Rolando Martinez of the Space Industry and Strategic Business Development Bureau. A warm welcome also to all participants both here in person and joining us via live stream on our YouTube channel. Your presence and engagement are invaluable contributions to today's discussion. Manila Calling is a series of briefings and lecture organized by the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Philippines, which aims to provide valuable information and timely insights into a spectrum of current and emerging developments. Topics will span political, socio-economic, and domestic issues, as well as foreign and international affairs that bear significant relevance to the Philippines. Today's session is in collaboration with the Philippine Space Agency. Our distinguished resource person for this session is Ms. Juliana Süß. I hope I got that correctly. Research Fellow on Space Security at the Royal United Services Institute. I now invite our PhilSA Director General Marciano for his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Jov. And once again, a warm welcome. Good afternoon to everybody, to Ms. Daniela Brown, Country Director of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Philippines. Ms. Juliana Süß, Research Fellow for Space Security from Royal United Services Institute. The attendees and representatives from KAS or KAS Philippines, my colleagues from PhilSA, virtual participants, those physically present here, ladies and gentlemen, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. And we will get to the substance of today's event shortly. I'll keep these remarks short, but we are very much honored and privileged to have this event here today. PhilSA welcomes our guests from Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and would like to express our deep gratitude for this opportunity to engage and interact. We're privileged to and grateful to hear from Ms. Juliana Süß, and who will share her knowledge and experience on global space governance, sustainability, perhaps some insights on counterspace capabilities, and the space as a domain that is increasingly becoming critical for governments and different actors all over the world. So I encourage everybody to take advantage of this opportunity to interact. Let me just say something. I know we already had a meeting there, and I guess we've had sufficient opportunity. Perhaps we could have another opportunity to do so, to introduce our agency more quickly. But let me just say, we have a mantra at the Space Agency, and for everybody, which we try to live up to or maybe recite every day, and that is to be a sponge, right? You know that, guys. Be a sponge. I'd like to share it with our guests from KAS Philippines, because we're here to be sponges. So that means as a sponge, not the marine kind, but not the cartoon one as well, but the sponge, which is the humble utility which absorbs. And by absorbing, you gain knowledge, but quite important, as you are squeezed and apply, then you apply. You know? Whatever it is that you learn, you apply. So I know there are also scholars here in the audience who are studying this very important and exciting field. So I encourage all of us to be sponges, to absorb as much as we can, engage, apply what we learn, and same time be that utility where these learnings and lessons are applied for the betterment of society and betterment of the planet. And on that note, let me thank KAS Philippines once again for your efforts here. We look forward to strengthening this relationship between PhilSA and your institute. And in the bigger picture, of course, between Philippines and Germany, this opens a door for even more engagement and interaction. You've heard also how we have been engaging our different entities in Europe, particularly the European Space Agency and the European Commission on various projects. These all serve as springboard for expanding further cooperation in space and cascading the benefits of space to our people, to Filipinos, and to the entire world. So on that note, again, thank you for this opportunity and encourage everybody, ask questions and engage. And thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you, DG. All right. Up next, we will have Ms. Daniela Brown, the Country Director of KAS Philippines, who will be sharing a short message and introduction of our resource speaker.
Magandang hapon, good afternoon. Dear Director General, distinguished guests, on behalf of KAS Philippines, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, a discussion on geopolitics in space. Thank you so very much for hosting us here at PhilSA. It's really great to be here and learn a little bit more about your important work. Space is really a fascinating topic which has inspired a lot of blockbuster movies. But space is also becoming a place of intensified geopolitical competition. Rival blocs race to be first to access the potential wealth of the moon and gain upper hand in what they view as an increasingly crucial domain. In the quest for supremacy, a successful exploitation of space resources is expected to provide winners with long-term economic and strategic advances. In today's world, space is vital for prosperity, and space power is now an integral element of international power. Technological advancements will be key to this space race and help to determine who will going to lead. Apart from that, we are also experiencing a growing role of private sector actors in space, which adds another layer of complexity. Looking at this space race, who are the most important actors and what are their strategies? Who is currently in the lead, and what are the other trends and developments which will shape the space race in the years to come? I'm very happy that I don't have to answer these questions to you, but I have a very knowledgeable colleague with me, Juliana Süß from RUSI, who will answer hopefully these questions and other questions from your side. The visit today is part of a program we are conducting since the beginning of this week, together with a small delegation of young security scholars from the Philippines and from Germany. For those of you who don't know us, KAS, we are a German political foundation. We are publicly funded, but we are independent from the German government. Worldwide, we work towards strengthening liberal democracy, the rule of law, social market economy, as well as freedom and security. In the country, in the Philippines, we are active since 60 years, so it's the oldest office for the foundation in Asia. And our main focus here is to support a strong democratic system, good governance, inclusive economic growth. We help to empower the Filipino youth, and an important field of work for us is also security and innovation. And security landscapes around the world have become much more complex with the return of interstate war, but also on the same time we see the emergence of new security threats arising from, for example, cyber domain or other technological advances. And with our work, we want to help navigating these increasingly complex security challenges. So it's really my hope that this lecture today will bring some added value to the discussion. In closing, I would like to thank again PhilSA for hosting us. Furthermore, I would like to extend my gratitude to our speaker, Juliana, and Director General and his team, and to all of you who are here today and who are willing to exchange with us. I'm really looking forward to an insightful debate about a very fascinating topic. So now I have the honor to introduce Juliana to you. Juliana Süß is a research fellow on space security as part of the military science team at the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, and is the host of a podcast called War in Space. She's also a member of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung working group of young foreign policy experts based in KAS, Germany. Prior to her current appointment, she was previously a project officer and research analyst at RUSI International. Her research interests include global space governance, sustainability, counterspace capabilities, and space warfare. Juliana holds an MA in Conflict, Security and Development from King's College London and a BA in Politics and International Relations from the University of Reading. Prior to joining RUSI, she was an intern for the Development, Concept and Doctrine Center, the independent think tank of the Ministry of Defense. There she researched various topics, including geostrategic, security and stabilization topics, as well as future and contemporary trends in warfare. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me Juliana Süß.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Daniela, for the kind introduction. Thank you to KAS Philippines for inviting me, allowing me to be here, and thank you so much also for the Philippine Space Agency for hosting me today. And thank you, Director General, for making the time in your what I'm sure is a very busy diary. I just want to voice a caveat, speaking as part of at a space agency, that I don't have an engineering background, as Daniela just mentioned. So any really difficult sort of space engineering questions, I refer you to the colleagues in the room. So yeah, I'm happy to do it. Speaking about the geopolitics of space, I want to give you the sort of bottom line up front, which is that space is no apolitical vacuum, right? The sort of politics of the day, the strategies of the day, the ambitions of states are being directly projected into space. The great power competition that we talk about, every day is also happening in space. And actually it's getting increasingly more difficult to hide in space and hide your ambitions and intentions in space. But I'll talk about that later. Now, I realize we have an audience that some of which, will know a lot about space, some of you not so much. So I just want to help everyone being able to visualize. Do I point at this? At the button. As I said, not an engineer. To help everyone visualize space, because I think it can be quite difficult to sort of really imagine what we're talking about. So this is actually a small plug, What's in Space, which is a great website, actually designed by Germany, or someone in Germany, to actually help us sort of visualize space. So you can look at it sort of any time of day, and it will show you where satellites are. And I think what this showcases quite nicely is not only the sort of Earth orbits that we talk about frequently, so lower Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and the geostationary orbit, which is the sort of ring around everything. But I think it also showcases the increasing congestion that we see in lower Earth orbit. Obviously, this is a sort of zoomed out view, but as you can see, the sort of orbits closest to us on Earth is getting increasingly busy. There we go. As I said, sort of geopolitics becomes or gets projected into space a lot, which leaves us with headlines around spying in space. It shows us about counter-space weapons and their impact also on the astronauts in space. But we'll talk about counter-space capabilities in a second. I do want to talk about the sort of huge dependence that we... Oh, that was way too fast. There should be another slide. I'll try and find it. It's not there. Okay, that's okay. We'll just stay here for now. The huge dependence that we have on space, obviously in the realm as well. If we talk about banking transactions, we talk about the internet, for example, but also on the military side, which is obviously what I specialize in, and that's really all aspects of sort of military capabilities. For example, intelligence collection, right? That's satellite imagery, it's SAR imagery as well that we heard about in the presentation. And actually also one of the first motivations to actually be active in space, right? The ultimate, or the sort of initial motivation to go into space was for a military benefit. I think we sometimes have this, nice romantic notion of space as a sort of, the frontier, that we want to explore and sort of explore humanity's horizon. And I think that's very nice. But unfortunately, I don't think it quite reflects the reality of the day. So intelligence collection, a huge aspect when it comes to space, and specifically, obviously, also during the Cold War, because it helped states, allowed states to kind of see where's the weapons developments, actually, what's the current state of things. Also helped the Americans realize that actually the sort of rocket or missile production of the Soviets is nowhere near sort of assumed it had been. But also positioning, navigation, and timing. Obviously, we all know GPS. I'm sure we all use it to find, the next bus stop, etc. But also, obviously, it has a military component as well. When we think about weapon systems, for example, or blue force tracking. So knowing where you are, where your adversaries are, where your friends are, etc. Communications, obvious one, I suppose. We've got internet constellations like Starlink. That term was meant to come up at some point in the lecture, might as well do it up front. But also military communications. So, allowing ships, allowing planes to communicate with headquarters further afield, etc. And lastly, early warning as well, being able to see missile launches early in advance. Now, this utility of space also immediately paints a target on its back. And actually, it always has been. So quick test for the audience. I'm sure the engineers will be bored with this question, but Sputnik was when? Yes, 57, that's correct. Can anyone guess when the first anti-satellite weapon was tested? No? It was 1959. 2 years after the first satellite was launched into space, people immediately thought of how can we potentially disrupt services as well. Which is why I want to talk about anti-satellite capabilities. And now someone already mentioned 2007, because that was one of the first big kinetic physical attacks. It was a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon that was tested by China in 2007, which left behind a lot of debris. So much debris, in fact, that in 2021, the International Space Station had to dodge a piece of debris from that test, 14 years after the fact, which also goes to show that debris is incredibly long-lasting and incredibly dangerous. Obviously, it depends on the incidence angle, it depends on, where the satellite that was destroyed was actually sort of positioned, etc. But I think it does go to show the incredible dangers of this. Also, little, well, not so fun fact, but a fact nonetheless, is that, for example, a piece of debris the size of 1 centimeter has the impact of a hand grenade. Just putting that out there for a second for people to imagine. So yeah, as you can see, we're not short of options in terms of disrupting or even destroying satellites. You've got the kinetic physical that I mentioned, the direct ascent anti-satellite weapon, tested by China, the US, India, Russia. Plenty of those tests that have been carried out. Obviously, all of them have always carried with them sort of general criticism from the international community, primarily because of the debris that I just mentioned. And what remains a red line is actually using that weapon against another state's satellite. So that has only ever been tested against states' own capabilities. Doesn't make it any less dangerous. We also have the non-kinetic physical. So with that comes high altitude nuclear explosions, for example, which would sort of cause electromagnetic pulse, which essentially fries the electronics on board of the satellites, especially if they're not EMP hardened. But it would also leave behind radiation in that orbit that would also degrade the satellites much faster that are in it. I want to focus, even though it's on the bottom, but I do want to focus on electronic and cyber attacks, because I think those are the attacks that we see for the most part, specifically in sort of modern day war and conflict. Both electronic and cyber attacks often also called gray zone activities, but that is really what we see for the most part. So there's definitely a sort of tendency to not use destructive weapons. Now, for electronic attacks, we've got to sort of feed disinformation to your adversary. We've also seen that quite a lot, spoofing in terms of what's been happening in Europe recently. So what's happened is that this has actually affected civilian airspace, and one airport actually had to close because planes just simply couldn't land. It always looked like a plane was circling the airport, even though it wasn't. Now, cyber. You can hack a satellite. You can hack a ground station. You can then control the satellite, worst case scenario, but you can also intercept the data that's being sent to the satellites. has been happening for a while. Actually, there was an attack on a US satellite ground station back in 2007 and 2008. The attackers didn't take control of the satellite, but they could have. They were so deep into the system that they could have maneuvered the satellite. They didn't do it then, but considering how far ago that was, I think we do have to really worry about sort of what capabilities are out there now. Now, Ukraine, I think it's been the most sort of, well, it's been the conflict that has really brought space to the fore, even though by no means it's the first conflict in which space capabilities have been used. It's quite often called the first commercial space war. I don't fully agree with that, just because it's not the first time that commercial space capabilities are used in a war. For example, back when the Americans were in Iraq and Afghanistan, 90% of the bandwidth they were using was provided by commercial providers. So this is not the first time by far. Also, speaking of cyber, since we just touched on it, actually the first sort of attack in 2022, when the Russians started the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, was actually a hacking attack against Viasat, which is a satellite internet provider. Actually, the modems were affected to the extent that they had to be sent back to the producer. They couldn't do a sort of long-distance fix, or at least it would have been perhaps more time-consuming, so they just sent out new modems. I think another thing that we talk about in the context of Ukraine a lot is the satellite imagery that we've gained. Obviously, this picture, I think, went around the world, a sort of military traffic jam that built up before Kiev, but also the troop buildup at the border that we could sort of witness for weeks in advance before the actual invasion took place. It's also helped the international community rebut Russia, for example, during the atrocities committed in Bucha, when Russia said, that wasn't us, that was staged, nothing happened in Bucha. Actually, we could come back to them with a satellite imagery that was time-stamped, of course, and say, we know when Russian troops were in the city, and we know what happened. Again, another thing that's been sort of talked about a lot is obviously Starlink, the provision of satellite-enabled internet to Ukrainian troops, but also Ukrainian civil society, enabling people to communicate during the war, to check in on family, friends, knowing where safe routes are, knowing where fresh water supplies are, etc. But also enabling Ukrainian troops to use drones, for example, which actually, this one perhaps looks a bit more high tech, but in general, some of these drones are actually just operated through Google Meets or Zoom. This is not sort of some high tech capability that we're talking about. Counterspace. We already mentioned the cyber attack against Viasat, but we've also seen quite widespread GPS jamming. Actually, not as much as we initially, partly because Russians hadn't sort of fully achieved their ideal positioning in the beginning stages of the war. But we do now see that GPS jamming is also affecting Western sort of capabilities such as HIMARS, JDAM, and Excalibur. If we're talking about geopolitics, we obviously have to talk about the space actors. So I've built a couple of sort of profiles that we can discuss, not to say that these are the only space actors, not by far, but I do think it gives us a good overview. The US, obviously, still the sort of predominant space actor that we see. Their budget is something that I think only the rest of the world can only dream of when it comes to space. They also established their Space Force in 2021, in addition to their Space Command, so that they have a sort of specific nerve center for the freedom of operations in space. We already heard about SSA earlier today, so space situational awareness, incredibly important for tracking your own satellites, tracking your friends' satellites, but also knowing what your adversaries are up to, what they've launched and what is currently in space. And they do have the most robust SSA capabilities in the world, partly also because of their allies and friends, right? Because then actually, in order to have these SSA capabilities, you do need radar stations and other capabilities dotted around the world to help you out. Certainly also helps the US in that regard, sort of knowing that their catalogue is the one that everybody else follows. The US also sort of set the standard when they initially declared space as a warfighting domain. NATO, for example, still calls it an operational domain. Perhaps more of a semantic discussion than an actual sort of declaration of anything, but we're certainly seeing space sort of prop up in discussions about war more and more. the elephant in the room, obviously, China. China's been investing a lot in space over the last couple of years. Have also been consistently hitting their timeline targets when it comes to the moon mission, for example. It's definitely become a high priority. We can see that through the government programs that are being prioritized, sort of incentives out there, and obviously also the money spent on it. Still nowhere near really where the Americans are, but I think they have at least sort of quintupled their funding since 2022. So certainly on a path to become one of the dominant space powers, and that's also their goal. So they did say that by 2045 they do want to be a fully comprehensive space power. I would argue they are well on their way to do that. Couple of sort of assets that help them do this. Tiangong Space Station, I'm sure many of you have heard it. We talked about the ISS earlier today and how it's being decommissioned in 2030. It's just very old and has been sort of had things added onto it over the years. But if you sort of see pictures of it, you see Tiangong and then you see the ISS next to it. ISS got like a million cables sticking out on the side, and then Tiangong looks very swish and new. And that's obviously because it is new and it's not been sort of had things added to it over the last 30 or so years. So Tiangong might, by 2030, be the only sort of continuous human presence in space, which obviously comes with a huge amount of sort of soft power as well. And actually, this is something that we see China leverage more and more when it comes to space. It's not just the capabilities that they're investing in, and believe me, there's plenty of them, but I think it's also really important to look at the other things. For example, the BRI, obviously the Belt and Road Initiative, that obviously has a space component, right? It has a cyber component. Obviously, it also has a space component, and that's the Space Information Corridor. And China itself has also stated that there's a sort of specific motivation as well to involve Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries for this. Specifically, for example, with the Beidou Foundation strengthening systems in Thailand, Laos, Indonesia, and Cambodia. Beidou, by the way, is the Chinese answer to GPS, essentially. It does also have a messaging function, but navigation is its prime sort of purpose. Along with the soft power that I mentioned, we also see sort of alliances being built by China when it comes to space, such as the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. Again, Thailand, Indonesia, and Turkey, for example, have signed this. And we see many more partnerships around the world. I think they've signed around 20, sort of signed up 20 countries with partnerships. But I think there is a bit of a backlash sort of starting up with this as well. They did used to build these sort of radar stations around the world and then had exclusive access to them, and with sort of contracts lasting incredibly long times. But for example, Sweden, Australia, and Chile have all cancelled their contracts, or at least not renewed them, because there were concerns that these radar stations were also being used for military purposes. I think another thing that helps China do this, and we will talk about sort of space governance in a second as well, but building up these partners, setting out your partners, these alliances, and, becoming one of the sort of leading voices in this, which is, China's goal and all of this, also does help you sort of set the norms and rules in space as you would like to see them. And especially when we talk about the sort of economic capabilities, it does also increase people's dependence on you and your assets. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about the remote sensing capabilities that China has. Just something else I wanted to highlight next to Beidou. A whole lot of imaging and general remote sensing capabilities, specifically in this region. So obviously this is a satellite image of Taiwan. There's a couple of ways that you can sort of calculate how often these satellites actually pass over an area. Obviously there's a margin of error involved, as always, but we think that at most there's a satellite over Taiwan every 30 minutes, just to bear that in mind. Now Russia. Russia's sort of space power star is certainly decreasing, however you want to call it. And there's obviously a partnership happening with China at the moment. My guess is Russia's a junior partner in this relationship at this point, because it has a lot less money. obviously it still has expertise, don't get me wrong, but they've been dealing with corruption, brain drain, aging infrastructures. Most of their constellations are outdated by now. They're really struggling to maintain them, let alone update them. I think the newest generation of their GPS system was around 10 years late. So really not sort of being able to update the systems at all. So I think the partnership that we see with China now is sort of a leftover of expertise, but we'll see how long it lasts. So we'll leave Russia at that. Happy to answer questions also on sort of how the Russians have used space capabilities in Ukraine. Spoiler alert, not that many, and happy to answer that in the Q&A. New space. Quick show of hands, who knows what new space is? There's a couple of non-hands, which either means I've bored you to death or I'll just explain it. So when we talk about new space, we generally talk about the increasing commercialization of space. And obviously we've all seen this, right? Several billionaires in the game, I won't name them, they get enough name drops anyway. So what we're seeing with this, and this is really unprecedented, because back in the day, specifically Cold War, 70s, 80s, rich states could go into space, right? And even then, only just, right? Now, students, universities, startups, space has become incredibly accessible. It does also mean we are congesting space more and more, and that's not just the fault, so to speak, of new space. There's a whole lot of other factors, but it's certainly changing the dynamics of the domain. It's also changing, I guess, the environment itself. So in terms of transparency, for example, and I did say earlier, it's becoming a lot harder to actually hide in space. We now have commercial capabilities in space that take pictures of space assets, right? So someone can say, oh, that thing over there, that's just a spent rocket body, don't worry about it. And then someone can take a picture and say, well, the spent rocket body has solar panels and a propulsion system. That doesn't really sound like a spent rocket body. So there's a whole lot that can be done these days. And actually, this is also something that both China and the US, as the predominant space powers that we have today, have come to see. They both have space planes of it, which they're both treating with extreme secrecy, not disclosing before launch which orbits they're going to be operating in, etc. And now hobby astronomers can go, oh, well, I know which orbit you're in. So really the transparency aspect, the sort of attribution problem that we talked about a lot before has certainly sort of vanished. Now, new space also means there's a whole lot more opportunities in space. It also means that actors are more able to actually get involved in space, become partners in space. It also means we see a lot more launches, right? Obviously, SpaceX has sort of paved the way here. There's now nearly a launch every week or more. And that's not something that we saw even 5 years ago. And I think new space has also contributed to the fact that space is no longer a luxury that only rich states can afford, right? I promise space governance, it's not the most cheery topic. I have to sort of say this up front. We do obviously have the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, obviously quite early, but it's really just a sort of contract of principles, which also gives it strength, I would argue. But really, when it comes to sort of weapons in space, it doesn't ban them. It simply says no weapons of mass destruction in space, which really is a low bar, if you think about it, right? The problem that we have since then, and believe me, there have been many sort of attempts to sort of add to the Outer Space Treaty and sort of flesh it out. There have been so many discussions. So many of them have failed. For example, one big one that no one can agree on is, what's a space weapon? Incredibly hard to actually define if we think about the fact that a piece of debris can actually do incredible damage to a spacecraft, right? And we talked about the dual use dilemma earlier in the meeting as well, in the sense that, for example, a satellite that can be used to clean up debris can also potentially grab a satellite and damage it in that way. So there's a whole host of factors that make this incredibly difficult. Quick list sort of the most recent endeavors that we've had. But really what's happened is a crystallization of two camps. And we've got Russia and China on one hand, and really, for the most part, the West on the other. So, for example, Russia and China back in 2008 put forward a proposal that simply said, don't place weapons in outer space. How do you verify that? How do you know what's a weapon? How do you know what's not a weapon? Then in 2020, the UK put forward the resolution on responsible behaviours. trying to say, you know, there's a whole lot of other things that worry us in space, and it's not just space weapons, it's also how you behave in space. How close do you get to someone else's satellite? You could intercept signals, for example. That's not necessarily a weapon as such, but you could intercept signals, you could spy on a satellite. Let's also talk about that, right? The rules of the road, so to speak. Those discussions went on for nearly 3 years, and if you read the final report, it's really quite depressing, because I think there was a lot of states that agreed on things. I think there was a lot of, I guess, political will to actually put this debate forward, to push the discussion forward, especially because we are more and more becoming dependent on space, right? Even if you're not a sort of spacefaring nation yourself, everyone depends on space, everyone uses space. So there's a real sort of motivation to make something happen. But yeah, unfortunately at the end, it was for the most part Russia, but also China, that sort of derailed the process, primarily by also questioning the process, asking why are certain actors in the room that shouldn't be here to discuss this with us, doing everything they could to actually prevent a real tangible discussion from taking place. So what now? Basically, the UN decided to have another 2-track process. So we will still be discussing responsible behaviours, but we will also be talking again about the Russia-China proposal, or sort of an amended version of that back from 2008. So not entirely back to square one, because I do think some sort of coalitions of the willing have been sort of informally appeared, but yeah, in the formal way, we are back to square one. So what? Great power competition in space. Not an apolitical space. Unfortunately, everything that we discuss here on Earth, all the problems that we have, we can also see projected into space. And our increasing dependence on space is also increasingly painting space to be a target, as counter-space capabilities and measures are also growing. I think any future conflict will involve space to some degree. And, we talk about space warfare and everyone thinks lasers and, a sort of Star Wars type scenario. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think it would be wrong to think that space will not be involved in some form or another. Now, what does that mean for emerging space powers? And I think when we talk about emerging space powers, that is most states, right? Like I obviously talk in the UK a lot, I speak to the Germans a lot, general European countries, a lot of them are struggling with the same thing, which is small budgets, you have to prioritize, you're already dependent on space, there's already sort of systems and infrastructures in place, but really you are starting out, you're setting out your strategies, you're trying to build your portfolio of space projects. What do you prioritize? And I think really, at least sort of what I keep telling sort of partners, or when I generally speak in these forums, is prioritize what is actually needed and where there are gaps. Because I think specifically when it comes to big things like navigation systems, for example, the UK is not going to build a navigation system now that they've been kicked out of Galileo, which is the EU navigation system. They didn't think about it, but then someone told them how much it would cost, and they decided that is not doable in any time frame. So, finding sort of niche capabilities that you can contribute to become part of the sort of greater alliances, specifically, actors like the US, but also collaborations and partnerships with, like-minded partners, whether that's space companies or that's, states as well. And I think another one, and I haven't talked about it that much, but it's usually my sort of soapbox discussion, is resiliency and creating resiliency in space capabilities as well. As I said, huge dependence on space, and to sort of have it suddenly knocked out through a cyber attack, etc. We do need to build resilient systems, whether that's through redundancy, having more constellations on hold, or working with commercial partners, is going to become incredibly important further down the line. We appreciate talk about space governance, anti-satellite capabilities. Do try the podcast. I swear we don't just talk about war. We also have lots of discussions about sort of legal matters in space. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Juliana. We've heard compelling insights from our resource speaker. She talked about the extent of utilization of space in terms of security threats, introduced as some major space powers and she also talk about the role of emerging space powers. So it's now our chance to engage directly. So if you may share your questions or thoughts, and maybe Juliana can address them in the discussion. Maybe we could take 10 minutes for the question. Yeah. Any questions from the floor?
Thank you for your lecture. Maybe I could start by talking about this dual aspects of, maybe not the dual use, but on the issue of space safety vis-a-vis space security. These two are always kind of maybe perhaps two sides of the same coin. And in the Outer Space Treaty, there is this articulation of principle of due regard, where we've seen how players could easily kind of accede to that principle by invoking safety, but on the other hand, for security, then things tend to be more opaque. So, what are your thoughts on that kind of position? Players make where there's lack of transparency as far as intent in the name of security, but on the other hand, with safety, that's, I guess, where countries can interoperate and share more information. Do you have some perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's actually exactly what I think is going to dominate the debate over the next 10, 15, 20 years, depressingly. I think there's a bit of a push and pull between sustainability and security, for example, right? Because we do need these technologies to actually prevent the continued congestion of space, right? We do need to figure something out to actually get rid of debris in a responsible manner. But obviously there's always going to be security concerns about how that's being done as well. Sort of quick, I guess, case study is that Russia built China built a satellite with a robotic arm in 2019 that can grab a satellite, place it into a graveyard orbit, so sort of where satellites go to die, and then came back to geostationary orbit. Huge sort of level of skill and sort of a capability that hadn't been seen before in such a way, in a practical sort of way, rather than just on paper. And I think certainly needed one, but obviously immediately, the headlines were, preposterous about what's happening and, what would happen if China grabbed one of our satellites, that kind of thing. And I think that's where transparency and sort of expression of intent is going to become more and more important. And actually, I think I did have it, the sort of 2013 working group on trust and confidence building measures, I think did go a certain way in actually talking about, how do we build up trust among actors to sort of carry out space missions that still sort of help us keep the domain, in a sustainable way, so we can keep using it, but also deploy these capabilities. And I think on the safety versus security debate, I think this is also something that diplomatically, people can hide behind, right? So obviously, safety is a sort of general, sort of non-nefarious activity, but also space weather, for example, and security is a sort of more. What are the motivations behind such and such a movement? And I think what's happened quite a lot is obviously with the two committees within the UN, things get pushed back and forth, right? Someone will say, oh no, that's a safety debate, that's not something we can discuss here, and vice versa. Which I think, obviously it's different sort of problem sets, but I don't think you can talk about safety without security and vice versa.
Thank you. Any more questions from our audience? Maybe we could take two more. Yeah.
Good afternoon. This is regarding the weaponization or militarization of space assets. You've mentioned that the Outer Space Treaties is more of principles-based, and there is no clearly defined, there is no clear definition of weapons of mass destruction. So what do you think is the most effective way to fill in the gaps or regulate not the placement of weapons in outer space? Would it be best if it is done through domestic law or through another treaty or any instrument? That's my question.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, just to briefly recap, because I think sometimes we do talk about weaponization and militarization sort of interchangeably when they're quite different. So militarization is using space for military purposes, which has obviously been happening ever since we entered space, whereas weaponization is the actual placement of weapons in space, which is what we're trying to avoid. I think actually that the responsible behaviours sort of approach is the best one, because I think what I'm worried about for the most part is actually the risk of miscalculation in space, not really knowing what your adversary is doing, what your competitor is doing, and sort of assuming that there's a nefarious activity when perhaps there isn't one, right? So I think responsible behaviours and actually discussing sort of how you're going to conduct yourself in space and what the sort of broad rules of the road are is going to be the most beneficial. That being said, I don't really see that happening in the next couple of years. I just think the geopolitical context in which all this is taking place and just does not lend itself to that level of trust, especially now that space has become such a hot topic and has increasingly also been used in the conflicts that we're seeing. So I think the sort of building of the coalitions of the willing that we've seen with many other sort of agreements as well is probably going to be a sort of good start. I'm not saying it's a panacea. I'm not saying it's going to solve anything immediately, but I do think we need to build sort of perhaps regional levels of consensus first before we then bring it back to the multilateral forum. For example, the US did this when they called for a moratorium on direct ascent and satellite weapon tests, right? And they've been gaining a lot of support for this. So they've got a lot of signatories for this already. I think it's things like this that are going to bring us forward. I'm not saying it's going to solve anything too soon, but I do think we need to, it's small steps, especially now, until we're in a better sort of place geopolitically where we can actually tackle this.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I think we could take this last question. Right.
We observed in a VUCA world system the intensification of power interplay that you mentioned about the US, China, and of course Russia in the context of space. To what extent can Southeast Asian countries adapt or develop in terms of strategies to make sure that we maintain the stability and order in the region in the context of space science and technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, when I was looking at ASEAN countries' space assets, I saw so many technology and development and research satellites. So certainly a lot happening. I think, sadly, again, it's back to resilience. I don't think we can ever really sort of exclude the possibility that something is going to happen, whether it's sort of temporary disruption or whether it's something worse than that. Yeah, I think specifically when we talk about the electromagnetic spectrum, I think spoofing, jamming is definitely something that has to be anticipated. So in terms of resilience measures, again, whether it's working with commercial partners, whether it's payload sharing with another nation or with another company, to sort of increase the resilience of your systems, to have more diverse constellations, but also, sadly, we do also have to think about sort of terrestrial alternatives in case space is actually not sort of usable or available, and that could be something non-nefarious, for example, like a solar storm as well. So I think sadly, yeah, resiliency and the sort of anticipation of disruption from the get-go will have to be, is something that I would advocate.
Thank you for those response, Juliana. Maybe we could have one more if you, for our yeah.
With space as an environment, as a domain, I've heard a school of thought say, well, if we mess up space, unlike climate change, where if we mess up the planet, some poorer nations tend to suffer more. Do you have any perspective of this? If space is messed up, there is a school of thought out there that says it's the richer nations with more investments in space that would tend to be more at the losing end of this. I don't necessarily buy into that because, as you said, many countries already depend on space infrastructure and services. But could you share some thoughts on that analogy that people are making between